Let me continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, Alive by Michael Ignatieff. This is chapter 11, Leningrad, 1945, the second part. In her eyes, Isaiah was serving as a messenger between the two Russian cultures, one in external exile, the other in internal exile, which had been split apart by the revolution. In the poems she wrote after his departure, she said that Europe was putting out its leaves, that a green shoot from the culture that had once been hers had at least coiled its way into the Fontaine dome. But she was categorical about the question of immigration. Solomon Andrinikova, Boris Rep, and others might choose the road of exile, but she would never leave Russia. Her place was with her people and with her native language, and so the night acquired another significance for her. It was a moment in which to reaffirm her sense of destiny as the all-enduring muse of her native tongue. Isaiah was quite sure he had never met anyone with such a genius for self-dramatization, but at the same time, he recognized that her claim to a tragic destiny was as genuine as that of anyone he had ever met. He had always sought validation by genius. It mattered intensely to him that Virginia Woolf, Freud, Wittgenstein, and Keynes had all seen his worth. But this encounter mattered more than any other. Here was the greatest living poet of his native language, talking to him as if he had always belonged to her circle, as if he knew everyone she knew, had read everything that she had read, understood what she said and what she meant. In reality, of course, this was an illusion. He knew far less about her than she supposed. Nonetheless, a moment of the purest communication, such as occurs only once or twice in any lifetime, was in the process of taking place. In a rising tide of enthusiasm and nostalgia, she told him of her childhood on the Black Sea coast, a pagan, unbaptized land, and of her lifelong affinity with Asian, half-Greek, half-barbarian, deeply un-Russian culture on Russia's southern shore. She recalled the Odessa she had known as a young woman, the brawling seaport of Isaiah Bible's stories, the meeting place of a Jew and a Basarabian, Turk and Ukrainian. He told her stories of his childhood in Riga, of his early years in Petrograd, and how, when she was already a poet so famous that her admirers could recite the whole of her latest collection verbatim, he was still a child, alone in his father's study, reading Menin-Ray's cowboys' stories. She told him of her marriage to Gumilev and how, despite their separation and divorce, she had always remembered the laconic and unquestioning way he had accepted her talent. When she described the circumstances of his execution in 1921, tears came to her eyes. Then she began to recite from Baron's Don Juan. Her pronunciation was unintelligible, but she delivered the lines with such intense emotion that the Isaiah had to rise and look out the window to conceal his feelings. Soon she was reciting her own poems from Anno Domini, The White Flock, from 6 books, and from Cleopatra, written in 1940s. At one of the lowest ebbs, when she wondered whether there was anything left but to die like the Egyptian queen by her own hand. She told him that poems like these had been the cause of the death of a better poet than she, but whether she meant Mandelstam or Gumilev, Berlin could not tell. For she broke down again. Recovering, she began to recite the still unfinished poem Without a Hero, began in Leningrad in 1940. It was, Isaiah later wrote, a kind of a final memorial to her life as a poet, to the past of the city, in the form of a 12th night carnival procession of masked figures. Listening to her, he could not have known that in this work, which she was to refine until 1962, he would eventually figure as the mysterious guest from the future, the guest from beyond the looking glass. She then read from a manuscript copy of a Requiem, much of it composed in a poem where they sat together. This cycle of poems was her act of commemoration on behalf of all the tortured and disappeared of her generation. Quote, I would like to name them all by name, but the list has been confiscated and is nowhere to be found. I have woven a wide mantle for them from their meager, overheard words. I will remember them always and everywhere. I will never forget them no matter what comes. End quote. She broke off to describe the arrest of her son and husband, speaking, as Isaiah remembered, in a matter-of-fact voice of her Virgil at the prison gates, of their humiliation at the hands of their jailers, of the desertion and betrayal of so many of their famous friends. She kept interrupting herself. It is no good. He remembered her saying, you come from a society of human beings, whereas here we are divided into human beings and something else. There had been years before the war when the circle of betrayal and denunciation bore down so harshly upon her that she had not been able to trust another living soul except Nadezhda Mandelstam and Lydia Tchaikovskaya. Of Osip Mandelstam and his fate, she could not speak. She changed the subject and forced herself to recall better times in Tashkent during the war. It was 3 in the morning when her son, Lev Gomiloyev, arrived. He was 2 years younger than Isaiah, 34 to Isaiah's 36, and phenomenally well-read and educated. Despite having been arrested at the age of 24, he had read Proust and Joyce in the original, despite never having left the confines of the Soviet Union, and obviously thought of himself, like his mother, as preserving European standards of culture against the Soviet tide. He had been arrested for the crime of having Nikolai Gumilev and Anna Akhmatova as his parents. Now he seemed convinced that his misfortune was over and that he would resume a scholar's life in his native city. He went into the kitchen alcove and found some boiled potatoes in a dish. His mother was embarrassed by the meagerness of their hospitality. But Isaiah remembered with pleasure how they divided the clutch of potatoes in a dish and ate them together in the near dark room by the glowing stove. When her son had left, Isaiah asked Akhmatova to let him write down Poem Without a Hero and Requiem. In a sigh of how hopeful she then was that she refused, promising that she would send him a volume of her collected verse, due to appear the following year. They then talked about their favorite authors and for the first time began to disagree. He shared her reverence for Pushkin, her distaste of Chekhov's mud-colored world, but he could not share her love of Dostoevsky, and she had no time for his affection for Turgenev. These were not mere differences of taste. They marked the boundaries between their emotional worlds. Isaiah drawn to the lightness, delicacy, and irony of Turgenev, but repelled by the violence, darkness, and emotional intensity of Dostoevsky. Akhmatova, identifying with Dostoevsky's intense depiction of inner states and unable to bear the delicate subtleties of Turgenev. These differences in moral taste were, of course, also differences of circumstance. Turgenev's delicacy struck an easy chord in Isaiah's Oxford, but it is hard to imagine how it could find an audience in Stalin's Leningrad. Isaiah was drawn most to Russian writers, Herzen and Turgenev, who had fashioned their art in exile, while Akhmatova was drawn to the artist whose work was forged on Russian soil. He always contrasted the open, passionate, spontaneous, broad Russian nature with the dry, calculating, inhabited, sophisticated West. But the reality was that it was the mixture of the two, available only to exiles, which moved him most. Nor was this their only disagreement. Isaiah idealized Tolstoy for the breadth of his historic vision, while Akhmatova was repelled by what she regarded as his sexual hypocrisy. In allowing Anna Karenina to be hounded to her death, she said, Tolstoy had capitulated to the Philistine social conventions he said he condemned. Isaiah was pleased to discover her scornful, sarcastic, and slightly malicious side. Then the queenly demeanor was replaced by something more humorous and human. He began to see that she was a consummate actress who had mastered a queenly role, but was shrewd and self-knowing enough to detach herself from it and see herself and others with an occasional glint of mockery. She spoke amusingly about Pasternak's recurrent crushes on her, how in the 1920s he would come over and sigh that he could not live without her, only to tie and beg his wife to come and take him back home. She confessed how lonely she was, how desolate her Leningrad had become. She spoke of her past loves for Gumilev, Shilenko, and Punin, and moved by her confessional mode, but also perhaps to forestall her erotic interest in him. Isaiah confessed that he was in love with someone himself. He was veiled, but it was clear that he was referring to Patricia Douglas. Akhmatova seemed to have passed on a wildly garbled version of these remarks about his love life to Connie Chokovsky, whose memoirs, published years later, referred to Berlin as a Don Juan disembarking in Leningrad to add Akhmatova to the list of his conquests. Akhmatova herself seemed to have been responsible for this melancholy. It was hung over their encounter ever since. No Russian who read Chink, the poems she devoted to their evening together, has ever been able to believe that they did not sleep together. In fact, they hardly touched. He remained on one side of the room, she on the other, far from being a Don Juan. He was a sexual nymphet, alone in the apartment of a fabled seductress, who had enjoyed deep romantic attachments with half a dozen supremely talented men. She was already investing their meeting with a mystical, historical, and erotic significance, while he fought shy of these undercurrents and kept a safe intellectual distance. Besides, he was also aware of a more quotidian needs. He had already been there 6 hours, and he wanted to go to the lavatory. But it would have broken the mood to do so, and in any case, the communal toilet had down the dark hallway, so he remained and listened, smoking another of his sweet cigars. As she poured out the story of her love life, he compared her to Donna Anna in Don Giovanni, and moving his cigar hand to and fro, a question she was to capture in a line of words, traced Mozart's melody in the air between them. They had now been talking continuously for hours, ranged back and forth from the street dog cafe to the blockade, from Leningrad to Oxford, across the whole course of their century, weaving together a chain of associations and connections that was to bind them to each other for the rest of their lives. They had talked of the most intimate things, and now they talked of the most abstract and otherworldly. He asked her whether the Renaissance was a real world to her or an imaginary one, and she affirmed that it was the latter. All poetry and art, she said, were a form of nostalgia, a longing for a universal culture, as Goethe and Hegel had conceived it, of what had been transmuted into art and thought, nature, love, death, despair, and martyrdom, of a reality which had no history, nothing outside itself. That evening in the Fontane Dome, in the bare and denuded room, with the potatoes in the dish, the Modigliani drawing, the cigar smoke slowly settling, Isaiah's life came as close as it ever did to the still perfection of art. But then it was light outside, and they could both hear the sound of a freezing rain falling in the fontanka. He rose and kissed her hand and walked back to the Astoria, dazed, turned over, exalted. He looked at his watch and discovered it was 11 in the morning. Brenda Tripp clearly remembered him saying, when he threw himself down on the bed of his room, "I'm in love, I'm in love." In his memory, there was nothing else of his visit to the city. Only Akhmatova. In fact, he stayed for a week in total, making the obligatory pilgrimage to a performance of Galenka's A Life for the Tsar at the Mariinsky Theater, visiting Rakhline at home in his apartment in the company with Randolph Churchill, and paying a call on the city's more or less thuggish political leaders. But all this, recorded in his official reports, quickly passed from memory. It is a sign of how fundamentally Akhmatova had moved him that, instead of the memorandum on Soviet foreign policy, which he had been sent to Moscow to compose, Berlin spent December writing a note on the literature and the arts in the RSFSR in the closing months of 1945. Its modest title belied its ambitions. It was nothing less than a history of Russian culture in the first half of the 20th century, a chronicle of Akhmatova's fitful generation. It was probably the first Western account of Stalin's war against Russian culture. On every page, there was a trace of what she, Chukovsky, and Pasternak as well, told him about their experience in the years of persecution. He insisted that the authentic voice of Russian culture remained the aging but articulate, deeply civilized, sensitive, fastidious, and not to be deceived, pre-revolutionary Russian intelligentsia. If anything, he idolized their courage and ignored their equivocations. For the rest of his life, they remained the gold standard, the touchstone of moral integrity. He had seen the audience of office workers and soldiers at the Mali and Mariinsky theaters, how they watched a play by Shakespeare or Boyodov as if it was a scene from the contemporary life, how they murmured approval or disapproval with intense hunger absent in the seated West. If he idolized this hunger, he had some reason to. Akhmatova and Pasternak had told him how frontline soldiers had known some of Pasternak's lines by heart. Prisoners in the Gulag sewed Akhmatova's poetry into handmade birch bark-bound books, which they carried about in their rags. This enduring sense that Russian culture would one day overthrow its Soviet shackles came from his night with Akhmatova, with his dispatch completed in December 1945. Berlin's secondment to the British embassy was over, and he had to return to Washington. But he decided that he must see her one last time. On 3rd January 1946, he took the Red Arrow overnight and booked into the Astoria once again. He was due to leave for Helsinki from the Finland station the next day. That afternoon, he called again at number 44, Fontana Dawn. She was alone, waiting for him, as regal as ever. She told him that the iron gates of the palace, always closed, had been opened the morning he walked away. She had an instinct for potence, and this, she believed, was one. He gave her a copy of Kafka's The Castle in English and a collection of the Sattwell's verse. She presented him with volumes of her poetry, each inscribed in her own hand. One of these dedications, referring to her belonging to, placed the black viper on her dusky breast with an indifferent hand. But she wrote that she had freed herself of Cleopatra's longing. She would endure. On a second volume, she wrote after a quotation from a poem without a hero, as if the lines, written long beforehand, had foretold their meeting. Quote, "No one knocks at my door, only the mirror dreams of a mirror, and the quietness stands guard over quietness." A. For January 1946, end quote. On another, she inscribed lines composed after his first visit, as he was to discover they formed part of a Chinkyu, a cycle of love poems charting the course of her own enchantment, her battle against hope, her exhilaration, and her sorrow at his departure. Quote, 1. As if on the rim of a cloud, I remember your words, and because of my words to you, night became brighter than day. Thus torn from the earth, we rose up like stars. There was neither despair nor shame, not now, not afterward, not at the time, but in real life, right now. You hear how I'm calling you. And that door that you have opened, I don't have the strength to slam. 2. Sounds die away in the ether, and darkness overtake the dusk. In a world become mute for all time, there are only two voices, yours and mine, and to the almost bell-like sound of the wind from invisible Lake Lodegar, the late-night dialogue turned into the delicate shimmer of interlaced rainbows. 3. For so long I hated to be pitied, but one drop of your pity, and I go round as if the sun were in my body. That's why there is dawn all around me. I go around creating miracles. That's why. End quote. They parted without embracing or touching. At the train station on the border with Finland, a venerable Soviet lady customs official looked over the books inscribed by the prescribed poet, bowed gravely, and let him pass through the looking glass into the other world. Absently, he journeyed through Helsinki, Stockholm, and Paris with clean, beautiful, silent, and empty as a tomb. After a brief stopover in England, he returned to Washington, but his thoughts stayed with Akhmatova, for in a letter written in late February, he was still talking about his visit as the most thrilling thing that has ever, I think, happened to me. He returned to the outside, she to the solitude of Fatoni Dome. Her desolation, even her anger, found expression a week after his departure in the last two poems of Cinque. Quote, 4. You know yourself that I'm not going to celebrate the most bitter day of our meeting. What to leave you in remembrance? My shade, what good is a ghost to you? The dedication to a burned drama, of which not an ash remains, or the terrible New Year's portrait, suddenly hurled from its frame, or the barely audible sound of birch embers, or that they didn't have time to tell me of another Slav. 5. We hadn't breathed the poppy's somnolence, and we ourselves don't know our sin. What was in our stars that destined us for sorrow? And what kind of a bellish brow did the degenerate darkness bring us? And what kind of invisible glow drove us out of our minds before dawn. Their encounter was one of those events which never ended, which spilled out consequences to the end of their lives. Within days of his departure, the secret police arrived while Akhmatova was out and clumsily installed microphones in her ceiling. They did not even bother to clean up the little piles of plaster they left behind on the floor. In the St. Petersburg headquarters of the security organs, there are 3 volumes of files totaling 900 pages of denunciations, reports of phone taps, quotations from writings, confessions of those close to her. The files, which began in 1939, were titled Hidden Trotskyism and Anti-Soviet Attitudes. The only person to have seen them, KGB operative Oleg Kulugin, gave a lecture on the Akhmatova file to a conference in Moscow in 1993, organized by the Heinrich Boy Foundation. Kulugin disclosed that the KGB forced an unnamed Polish woman who was translating Akhmatova's work to inform on her. She told the KGB that the English spy Berlin had visited the poet on 2 occasions and had declared his love for her, even through the coarse element break of an informer's gaze. Akhmatova comes across as a regal and imperious figure, melancholy, proud, and unafraid. In April 1946, Akhmatova traveled to Moscow and with Pasternak gave a poetry reading in the Hall of Columns. A severely censored collection of her work had appeared, and she read from it, wearing her severe black dress and a white shawl. Once again, as in 1944, she was frightened by the intensity of the adulation. As she later recorded, I knew I was doomed the moment a girl ran up to me and dropped down on her knees in the Hall of Columns after I finished reciting my poetry. That night, she was reunited with Pasternak, and in his apartment, they ate, drank, and recited poetry together. They also discussed Isaiah. In a letter that Berlin received in July 1946 through the British Embassy, Pasternak told him, quote, when Akhmatova was here, her every third word was you, and so dramatically and mysteriously. At night, for example, in a taxi on the way back from some evening or reception, inspired and weary, and slightly in the clouds, in French, not ami, that's you, a date, or a promise, etc., etc. In the end, those of her friends who were jealous of her, to you, began to pester me with requests. Boris Leningrad, please describe Berlin for us. Who is he and what is he like? One then followed my praises, and only then did their real torments begin. Everyone loves you and recalls you with great warmth. End quote. That summer, Isaiah continued to keep them both in the forefront of his mind. He was back in England by then, and while standing on Oxford Station platform, he approached the university vice-chancellor and suggested that Pasternak be proposed for an ordinary degree. The vice-chancellor said that he had never heard of the name. In any event, he said he disapproved of using degree ceremonies to make political gestures. Akhmatova was quite correct to fear the outpouring of emotion at her Moscow readings. Over the summer of 1946, the news was slowly tightened. Little Zeta Mandelstam, who visited her at the Fountain Dome, remembers that shadowy figures with ugly marks shadowed them whenever they went out walking. Once, on returning home, they found the gates locked and were unaccountably held up by the doorkeeper. When they were finally let into the courtyard, a flash gun went off in an upstairs window. The operatives were taking their picture. Then in August, Akhmatova was in the Writers' Union, that idiotic old people's home, as she called it, and noticed that people were avoiding her glance and visibly edging away from her. On her way home, she brought some fish and had it wrapped in a newspaper. She met Mikhail Joschenko by chance, and he asked her in great distress what they were to do. She replied calmly that they must bear with it, not understanding why he seemed so agitated. When she got home and unwrapped the fish, she read in the newspaper that a party resolution had just censored the magazines of Zavada and Leningrad for publishing their works. A week later, Andrei Zhukov issued a party report in which Akhmatova's work was described as the portraits of a frantic little fine lady flitting between the boudoir and the chapel. Her poetry was a reactionary concoction of sadness, longing, death, mysticism, and doom. She was left over from the old aristocratic culture, half nun, half harlot, or rather a harlot nun, whose sin is mixed with a prayer. On 4 September 1946, she was expelled from the Writers' Union, and her book of poems, the one she had promised to send Isaiah, was pulped. Once again, he had been consigned to darkness and purgatory. Although, as the KGB recorded, there were anonymous neighbors and friends brave enough to leave a bouquet of flowers and parcels of food at the door of a 44 Fontaine Dome. Eventually, these stopped, and with the arrest of Lev in 1949, once again for the crime of being her son, Akhmatova's desolation was complete. She had no doubt that these catastrophes were all the result of Isaiah's visit. She did not blame him for this. It was her destiny that it be so. He always saw her situation in the grandest perspective. For her, Berlin's visit and Zhdanov's subsequent condemnation of her work marked nothing less than the beginning of the Cold War, the end of wartime cooperation with the Western Allies, and the resumption of the ideological, moral, and political war between the two radically different world orders. Of Berlin's visit, she wrote, quote, "He will not be a beloved husband to me, but what we accomplish, he and I, will disturb the 20th century." End quote. This was grandiose, but not entirely wrong. She had been told, probably by Pasternak, that Stalin had reportedly read the KGB surveillance reports and had said to Zhdanov, quote, "So now our nun is consorting with British spies, is she?" Quote, end quote. When, therefore, she wrote in Poem Without a Hero that her night with a visitor from the future would change history, she meant it seriously. Isaiah had never calculated the consequences of his visits, either to her or to his family in Moscow. But as the years passed, he began to realize how terrible these consequences had been. Throughout 1947 and 1948, the embassy in Moscow attempted to allay his anxieties about Akhmatova's fate. He heard that she was well and living quietly in her flat on a state pension of 600 ruble a month. He went to blame himself for the difficulties she had endured. Another letter painted altogether bleaker picture. While Pasternak was left alone to write his novel, Akhmatova had lost her writers' union card and was in miserably reduced circumstances. In May 1947, the embassy forwarded a copy of Andrei Zhdanov's latest strictures on Soviet philosophy, and Isaiah could see that the ideological pressure of the party was as unrelenting as ever. In April 1948, his friends in the Moscow embassy advised him that anti-foreign xenophobia was running so high that any attempt to make a contact would only endanger her further. For the next 6 years, he had no further news. These were among Akhmatova's darkest years. In desperation at her son's rearrest, she bowed to the regime, composing a few perfunctory and unconvincing odes to the comrade Stalin in an attempt to secure his release. This gesture was all the more humiliating because it was unsuccessful, for Stalin was not fooled. The aging Kremlin mountaineer could have read the astringent things she had said about him in the file in the Leningrad KGB archives. There are, so Olive Kulagin reports, she regretted her fate with a certain grim relish, telling the Polish informant that she was proud of Stalin's unflagging interest in her, just as proud as she was of the anonymous bouquets left at her front door. People forget the fed cats, she said, but they do not forget those who suffer. Stalin died in 1953, but her ordeal continued. In May 1954, a party of English university students visited the Leningrad House of Writers. Akhmatova and Jaschenko, tense, pale, and at bay, were paraded in front of them. The only student who spoke Russian was Harry Shukman, then an undergraduate at Nottingham University. In all innocence, Schumann asked whether there was any place for satire in Soviet literature. The questions put both writers in an impossible position. A single word out of place would be pounced on by the party hags in the room. Zakhchenko replied that there was room for satire, a foolhardy, if a courageous remark, which was to cost him dear, and then fell silent. When asked for her opinion, Akhmatova snapped that she was in agreement, whether with Jaschenko or with the disgrace was deliberately left unclear, and then she too fell silent. She went home believing that the students had been sent by Isaiah. In fact, none of them was from Oxford, and he had no knowledge of their visit. He never doubted that his visit to Akhmatova was the most important event in his life. He came away from Russia with a loathing for Soviet tyranny, which was to inform nearly everything she wrote in defense of Western liberalism and political liberty thereafter. His fierce polemic against historical determinism was animated by what he had learned from her, namely that history could be made to bow before the sheer stubbornness of a human conscience. But his visit to Russia also left him with a burden of guilt. Everyone but him paid a price for his visit. Between 1948 and 1953, the wave of anti-Semitism rose to a crest. Soviet Jewish institutions and publications were closed down on part of a general crackdown on supposedly nationalist and cosmopolitan manifestations in Soviet life. This culminated in 1952 with the arrest, trial, and execution of 15 prominent Jewish doctors for plotting the murder of Stalin. Isaiah's uncle Leo was rounded up and accused of belonging to a British spy ring that included his brother Mendel and his nephew Isaiah. The accusers linked Mendel's visit to the Timber Mission in 1935 with Isaiah's visit in 1945 and alleged that British intelligence had placed Leo in the university dietetics clinic in order to gather information on the health of Stalin and other Soviet leaders. The purpose of Isaiah's visit, so the interrogators insisted, was to take Leo's information back to British authorities in London. Leo Berlin was beaten until he attempted suicide. Then, simply to bring his tortures to an end, he confessed that he was indeed a British spy. He was held in prison for over a year and released in February 1954 after Stalin's death. He was walking in the streets in Moscow, still weak and undernourished, when he saw one of his torturers cross the road in front of him. He suffered a heart attack and died alone in the snowy streets.